Tell me a little bit about the gender research that you are doing in your work.
Okay, thank you, Alisia. I am currently working on completing a book on 3 generations of Fiji women soldiers, women who've served in the Fiji military as well as in the British Army. Prior to that, I had done research on militarism more broadly, but the sort of gendered aspects of militarism. So I've published a paper on masculinity and militarism in Fiji in the 1990s. So I've had a long interest in gender and especially militarism. I've also recently completed a piece of work for the Ministry of Social Development in New Zealand on developing a conceptual framework to help support work around Kiribati family violence in New Zealand. And what's been interesting for me around that is that I'm a feminist scholar, but I'm also committed to Indigenous ways of knowing, and sometimes feminism doesn't fit in with Indigenous ways of knowing. So my work with the Kiribati community in New Zealand, required that I kind of hold my feminism in reserve and just let the knowledge come out on its own terms. And so, issues of respect, issues of care were able to come out in the Kiribati language for the communities to help them think through what their culture allows them, enables them to do to prevent family violence in their own communities. So that's some of the work that I've done. As an academic at Victoria University, I teach. I also supervise theses. So one of the things I talked about on Tuesday was the number of theses that we've completed through our program at MA level and PhD level, which have focused on gender. So just highlighted those. Also looked at some of the work that I've co-supervised in other departments, like development studies that have focused on gender in the Pacific. And then I talked on Tuesday about, so that was kind of explaining my local context in Wellington. And then I talked about a regional context. And the example I gave is a professional association that I'm involved in called the Pacific History Association. And I just mapped out some of the papers at the recent conference we had in Guam, which looked at gender. And it was quite striking because even though our association regularly pays attention to gender is still marginalized. So we were at a conference that had over 200 papers presented, and only 13 of those papers looked at gender explicitly, right? So that just helps give people an understanding of how gender, it's still hard to get gender onto the table for consideration, yeah? And then the final thing I talked about on Tuesday was some more global or international work that I do through a journal called the International Feminist Journal of Politics. And one of the things I explained in my discussion about that journal is that even though I'm on the editorial board, even though there are a lot of women on the editorial board from the Australasian region who know all these feminist researchers and gender researchers, Pacific research isn't filtering into that international academic forum. And so I just raised some questions about why that is. Even though I tried to get people to submit I've been involved with this journal from 2003 to the present, and only 2 Pacific papers have come through our refereeing system, and neither of them were authored by Pacific people. Yeah. So it's a challenge. Doing gender research is so important in the Pacific for helping us understand inequality in our societies. And there is a lot of research taking place. But one of the things this workshop has highlighted, and the scoping paper has highlighted, is that there's all this research done, but it's kind of going nowhere, and we need to help it get somewhere. So it needs to get off of shelves, it needs to get out of libraries, and it needs to be informing policy, or it needs to be shared with communities so that communities can be empowered with this knowledge, with this great research that's been done. So this workshop has been just a wonderful experience for, I think for a lot of researchers to take stock of what they've been doing, but then help them, kind of galvanize them around things that other people are doing, and give them ideas. Certainly that's what I've gotten in the last few days, is I've gotten ideas about how we can get our research off shelves, and help empower communities with the things we're researching.
I remember you made a point, I think it was in one of your just kind of group feedback to the main plenary, about the power of radio and the media to get that information to the community. Would you mind elaborating a bit more on that?
Yeah. Well, as you know, radio is such an important medium for our people, and it's often the most reliable and most accessible medium. And one of the things I learned from the Kiribati conceptual framework research we did was that power of radio. We have, I think, 2 or 3 hours a week of Kiribati programming on a national radio network in New Zealand, but everybody listens. And so what the working group that worked on the conceptual framework did was they appointed a media person, and the media person at every stage of our research went and spoke on that radio program, that once a week radio program. And it just helped the whole community not only understand what we were doing, but start to, it initiated conversations about family violence that otherwise would not have taken place. So that was a wonderful example, even in New Zealand, where you have access to all kinds of media, but radio is still the most reliable one, especially for communities for whom English is not their first language, right? So I grew up here in Fiji, and I know how important radio was to us growing up before television and before the internet. But even now, I know how important radio is for outer island communities to access, news and access information.
Just one more final point. Today we've been talking about collaboration and partnerships, especially between action-oriented research that NGOs may be more likely to carry out compared to academic research. So how do we bridge that gap? We're all looking for how do we change policy, how do we get to that policy decision-making level. What do you think is the most important thing, if you could pin it down to that?
I think that both spaces are really important. And as I said on Tuesday, the academic space is so precious because it allows us to ask questions that sometimes we're punished for asking off campus, right? And what universities are supposed to uphold is that freedom to question, that freedom to think, beyond normal boundaries. So academic freedom is really important. And I think you'll find that a lot of the NGO and even public sector government workers, they've come through university and they've had that privilege of academic freedom, but then they've gone back into work, and then pressures of work, pressures of funding or pressures of, demonstrating KPIs, really start to play. And somehow there's this discourse that emerges that academics are privileged and they're not relevant, they're not doing relevant work, when in fact there are partnerships, there have been partnerships There should continue to be partnerships, but not at the expense of academic freedom, right? So I'm really convinced that we need a space where we can critique government. Yeah? Sometimes when you're in partnership with government, you can't critique them. So we need to always preserve that space of academic freedom. But partnership is important because partnership is about empowering. Yeah? And so if you can move research out off shelves, then you're empowering people. But you need, one of the things we discussed in a group I was in, is you need these translators. You need connectors. You need people who can kind of break down the complexities of your research into forms and media that will reach people. So there's so many ideas that have been shared about partnership over the last few days. And one of the things that I'm taking away is a need to move from the engagement that our program's been doing into partnership. Yeah. So we've been doing a lot of community engagement, but no partnership. And I think what partnership does is it gives you focus and it gives you purpose. And so there's some good models that we've learned about for helping to make partnerships successful. But one of the things I'm committed to is starting small. And I think with a lot of aid money floating around, there's a real temptation to go big. But I think, it's been my philosophy all along. You start small, you build your foundation, make sure it's really strong, and then you can, tackle bigger things. So yeah, I like the ways that partnership has been modeled here and has been talked about here.